Well, the leaders of 7 EU member states have arrived in Helsinki for the first Eastern Flank Summit, which is being hosted by the Finnish Prime Minister, Petteri Orpo. The summit follows several incidents involving Russian drones and aircraft violating European airspace. It's going to focus on security threats and defence readiness at the EU's eastern border and the NATO Eastern Flank, which includes the Baltic States, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria. The Helsinki meeting is being attended by the EU Eastern Flank Watch, the larger group of companies that borders Russia on land and at sea. Leaders will discuss joint strategies and seek EU funding for drones, air defence systems, extended border surveillance and increased ground force mobility. Let's see if we can piece our way through this with our Brussels correspondent, Teri Schultz. Welcome, Teri. This is the first ever Eastern Flank Summit. Talk us through what's on the agenda.
You gave a pretty good menu there, Phil, of what these countries want. As you mentioned, these are the countries on the front line: Sweden, Finland, the Baltic States, Bulgaria and Romania, who are attending this first summit called by the Finnish Prime Minister. And these are countries that are basically under constant hybrid attack from Russia, and they'd like the European Union to help them do more about it. So the European Commission has proposed 4 flagship projects, and you mentioned some of them. What used to be called a drone wall, now I think they call it the Drone Defense Initiative, an Eastern Flank Space Shield, an Eastern Flank Air Shield, and what they're calling Eastern Flank Watch. They'd like to see EU money put into these projects because they say that they are the ones on the front line with Russia. But some of the bigger countries, Germany among them, France for another one, and some of the southern countries, those that are not on the first line of defense, would not like to see the EU pour billions into these projects. So this Eastern Flank Summit is really designed to bring together a unified position, put one more strong voice into this week of very hectic diplomacy before the EU leaders gather here in Brussels later this week.
It's been quite a week for diplomacy. The backdrop to this, of course, being these ongoing peace talks between Ukraine and the United States, and indeed Russia and the United States. What are the diplomats there saying about this peace process?
Well, you know, going back to the Eastern Flank leaders, one of the things that people don't often think about is that even if there were peace between Ukraine and Russia, they're not necessarily safer. And that's something that we heard the leaders say upon their arrival in Helsinki this morning. A reminder that if Russia stopped fighting Ukraine, then it would have time to regenerate its forces and possibly move them back to the borders with Helsinki, with Finland, for example, where they've largely been moved from. So these countries are uneasy, even if there is a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Here in Brussels, of course, leaders are giving a cautious welcome to any effort to try to end this war. But what we constantly hear repeated is that Moscow has shown no willingness to enter into a peace deal. And so while things may be optimistic when you're talking with the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and now the Americans, that doesn't mean that this is going to hold up once you take it to the Kremlin. So people are, again, cautiously optimistic about what has been achieved, but not necessarily expecting it to hold once Russia is brought into the negotiations, Phil.
Thanks, Teri. DW's Teri Schultz in Brussels. The Finnish Prime Minister called on EU leaders to make defending the Union's eastern flank a priority given the threat from Russia.
The fact still is that we do not see any signs that Russia really wants peace. Russia remains a threat today, tomorrow, and in a foreseeable future for the whole of Europe. This is the reason we are strengthening our cooperation. We share a strong political will to reinforce our common security and Europe's defence, starting from the Eastern Flank.
Well, let's look at their fears with Christopher Morris, who's a defence analyst at consulting firm Callian Europe. He joins us from Stavanger in Norway. Welcome to DW. Could you give us a sense of the specific threats these countries are worried about?
Okay, in terms of the specific threats that NATO is currently facing on the eastern flank, well, it's a lot of the kind of weapon systems and threats that we've seen in the Ukraine conflict, things like short-range missiles and drones, sabotage of critical systems such as ports and energy, airspace violations and constant probing from the Russian side, and of course, a range of hybrid pressures that never quite cross the threshold into war, but nevertheless cause an awful lot of disruption, things like cyber attacks. Now, this is not necessarily the type of threat that NATO members further west usually experience, where they have a little bit more thinking time and have to deal with long-range threats or get to mediate their reaction to expeditionary operations. So it's really interesting what is happening in the east at the moment and, of course, the north.
OK, but I'm guessing, because I'm no NATO planner, that NATO will have looked at a map and said, oh, that might be a problem there, that bit close to Russia. Why is it that these countries have decided that they need to get together? What do they think they will get from each other that they're not already getting from NATO?
Well, these nations, when you look at them together, have a fundamentally different perspective from some of NATO's more Western, I suppose, partners. In a way, you can look at it like this. Where Western nations might see these nations as their crumple zone, I think these nations would rather be barriers. And they're kind of looking at how can they anchor this front line and work together in order to ensure that they don't have to deal with Russia in the immediate future. So really, it's about the Poles, the Finns, and the Baltics really working together because their margin for error is substantially smaller than the luxury that we have in more Western geographies.
That's a very vivid metaphor you use there. And do you believe that is indeed the case? Does NATO regard these countries as its crumple zone?
Well, that's perhaps a bit of a dramatic way of putting it, but I think we're definitely going to see a cognitive divide between nations to the west and these frontline nations. They're going to have different assumptions about timelines, different tolerances for risk, and of course, a different understanding of what it means to be defensive. You've also got to keep in mind that many of these, I suppose, nations have either historic or in many cases more recent first-hand experience dealing with the Russian war machine. And as a result, they are going to have fundamentally different perspectives. So there is probably going to be a bit of a cognitive divide on that basis.
OK. Tell us about this drone war, which I think is one of the items on their agenda. Talk us through what it is and what they hope it will do.
It's interesting. Now, whenever you hear the word drones are certainly part of it. But the message that's really coming through is that we need to adapt to the changing technology and the changing face of war that we've seen manifest in places like Ukraine. So it's really, how does NATO come to terms with that? And what does that look like in terms of the technical and material support that other nations can offer to the front line? Now, at the moment, this is a key vulnerability. Now, effectively, drones give Russia the ability to degrade NATO capabilities and effectively cause financial harm for pennies on the dollar. You know, drones very cheap, countermeasures very expensive. And of course, there is a major incentive to prevent incursions and prevent any damage these drones could potentially cause. So as a result, really closing that vulnerability is going to be a key preoccupation for both NATO in general and critically these nations on the front line who are going to be dealing with it directly. So what we're really going to be hoping to see come out of this conference is a concrete path forward for dealing with this relatively new and ever-changing threat emanating from drones.
But this is really interesting because we have heard about this drone war before as a sort of as a NATO exercise. If that's already on NATO's agenda, why is this small group of companies looking at this and saying, well, you're not moving fast enough? Because clearly, if that is the case, this is feeding into what Russia is hoping to achieve in driving a sort of wedge through NATO countries.
Again, I think it's going to come down to different perception of what the threat of drones means. Now, in terms of the capacity for Russia to keep up like high volume attacks using lower expense weapon systems, we've seen an awful lot of that in Ukraine. Now, that is a far more immediate threat if you are on the NATO front line than if you are in Western Europe. That's not to say that this is not an equally big problem for the nations like Germany and Norway and Sweden that have seen drone activity recently. But if you're on that front line, you know that it can represent a critical and immediate threat to your critical infrastructure, to your energy, to your ports. And as a result, it's really about doing what you can in the immediate future to blunt this threat as much as possible. Now, in terms of leveraging the technology and closing this gap, it's still uncertain as to what that might look like. But one thing is for sure, it's going to be technologically involved and it's going to be expensive. Now, these nations are absolutely going to be looking to spread the cost, and they're going to be looking further west for both funding and support as they build this network.
Fascinating analysis. Thank you for talking us through it so clearly. Christopher Morris from Callian Europe.
Thank you.